What we have here is one of the original Mewlon 250 Delcroocum Cassegrains, and I started using this telescope several years back, and after I started working with Newtonians, and I found it as an interesting alternative to a Newtonian for observation of the solar system, which I do a lot here in SoCal. One of the important things when you're using high quality scopes is to use a good quality diagonal. There's several different ones that are out in the market, but you shouldn't buy a diagonal solely based on its reflectivity. I never have. So you want to check the diagonals and make sure they're good. There's a way to do that. We can discuss that later. This thing that you see here is called a cooling angel, and basically I developed this just to help break up the boundary layer that surrounds the substrate. The primary mirror is roughly 1 inch in diameter, and there's a lot of misconceptions people have about cool down, a lot of assumptions that people make. The environment that you play or that you view in has a significant effect on how the views will appear. Now, interestingly, I don't even use this scope initially at the beginning of the night. I do look at planets with it primarily, and I do look at deep sky objects, meaning smaller star clusters, maybe some galaxies or things that are smaller in scale, because the field of view is somewhat limited. Granted, you can still put like a 50 millimeter axiom or one of those TAC LE eyepieces. I have one of those, they work nice. But the thing that I want to explain that I think is so interesting about this is that a lot of times people assume that these things cool in an hour. And not only that, people think that because the tube is open that it cools fast. And quite frankly, that's actually the problem with these telescopes that are open tube. This topic's been discussed for many, decades, by people that have written books and things of that sort. But I want to explain to you how it really occurs in reality. Now, in my deltas, meaning from day to night, are not that dramatic. If you're in Florida, for example, if you look at the temperature curves, they're not that drastic. They're very subtle, maybe 10 degrees at most. The Florida Keys, where people observe, sometimes people's telescopes perform better there because temperature isn't dropping so rapidly. So if you're in a place like, Wisconsin or Colorado, and you get these weird deltas, these dramatic changes in temperature, that's going to be a real issue for an open tube telescope. It's not to imply that closed tubes like SCTs or MACs are necessarily better or anything like that. It's just that the fact that the air is able to make contact with the substrate is what's causing that release. It's that transfer of heat from the substrate into the air that's causing all the turbulence that you see in there. And so sometimes when I hear people say, oh, the tube is open, it's going to cool faster, it's not that simple, and it just doesn't work that way in reality. Just to give you an example, I'll actively cool this thing for about 2 hours and use the refractors from roughly, say, 8 o'clock till about 11:30, 12 o'clock. And then after that, when the planets get higher and the temperatures have settled and remain fairly stable, I'll turn off the fans, put the seal back on, and then rely on passive cooling only. Passive cooling is where you're just relying on the air itself. There's no intervention. There's no human intervention with fans or anything of that sort to cool it. And in a climate like mine, I can get away with that, but not everybody in the country can get away with that kind of thing. And so there's a point of diminishing return where you're spending all this money to take advantage of some of these optics, and you're not really getting the full potential out of them because of the circumstances that you live in. So I'm going to go ahead and orient this tube so you can see this. Are we good? And let you see inside. You can see in this particular model, there's a 3-vein spider. On the newer ones, there's 4. So inside of the tube is a baffle, and there's knife edges. There's a couple of problems with this. The knife edges, it's hard to believe this, even in an open tube, the baffle itself retains heat for hours, not like minutes, but hours. And the way you can verify this is just simply put your finger in the backside just to see, and you'll feel the temperature in there. And this can linger on into the night. So what I do is I usually leave the fans on and just let this thing acclimate for a good 2 hours at least, and try to get this thing acclimated as quickly as possible. And then view with the refractors prior. And then I'll go ahead and start pointing these at the planets to take advantage of the additional aperture and whatnot. The other thing that's important about the baffle, and I rarely hear this discussed in reviews, and it's so important, is the tension on the baffle actually alters the spherical correction. So if I were to take that baffle, right, you can take that baffle on and off, but when you press it or turn that baffle clockwise, it puts pressure against the primary mirror, and it causes the mirror to undercorrect. And what that means is that the light rays from the outer perimeter of the optic are converging inwards faster or closer than light rays from the central portion of the primary mirror. So it's super important to check the star test with relevance to the baffle and make sure that the baffle is not too tight. This has a major effect on the contrast that you're going to see in focus. One of the problems with this, though, is that I notice is that when you do meridian flips, it comes out of collimation slightly. And the reason that happens is because I don't want the baffle to be too tight. So it's the delicate balance of just getting the tension just enough that it won't affect the spherical correction too much, and just enough that it won't alter the collimation if you have to do a meridian flip. There have even been some cases where I will just say, forget it, I'm just going to decide that I'm going to view on one side of the meridian for the entire duration of the night, and then recollimate if I'm going to view on the other side of the meridian. Now that might seem extreme for some people, especially when you have a six screw configuration here where you got a push-pull system here. So it can be a little daunting, and it can take quite a few minutes to actually get this thing collimated. I discussed the issue with Peter Saravaldo at a trade show in Arizona at one time about this issue with the baffle being tight and everything, and he was very familiar with it because he's an expert in this field and who I have a great deal of respect for. And one of the things that he had mentioned is having a slight adhesive on the inside of the substrate just between the baffle a little bit, just enough to hold it, nothing too crazy, dramatic where you couldn't ever get the primary mirror out, but just enough to secure it in there so it wouldn't shift or anything like that. But so far what I've done instead is I've just adjusted the tension on the baffle just to the right amount where I can star test it and check the spherical on it and make sure it's perfectly good. That is another reason why I am very skeptical about star tests or evaluations where they're bench tested or taken to labs in controlled environments and this issue is not addressed. If it's not discussed, I'm very skeptical of the reviews. So just a thing to be aware of. All right, so I want to talk about the thermals for a minute and go back here, because I think thermals are one of the biggest problems that tubes endure in order to perform. And there's things you got to check before you can even get to the telescope. Things like the CRWS jet stream map, the direction that the air is flowing. Am I getting onshore air? Am I myself an issue with the telescope? We are like heat furnaces. If you could see our body in the right light, they have these things called Schlieren Tests. And Brian Greer conducted some tests where he did Schlieren Tests on substrates, where he'd take the mirrors out, check the temperatures, and see how long that it took for them to cool. And one of the things that they found out is if you were to cool a mirror or substrate from the front and rear, it would basically cut the cool down time or acclimation or delta period in half, as opposed to just going through in the back. So the way I get around that is to just cool the back, but just forget about the scope and just leave it for a couple hours and just view through it later on. But what I want to emphasize is that don't underestimate cool down. It is so incredible. We sit and we bicker over these, it's like these forums that we discuss on cloudy nights. And, I'm a cloudy nights guy. You guys have seen me on there. But one of the things that people discuss are a lot of technical specs with regard to optics. Those are far superseded when you deal with thermals. It just blows everything away. And sometimes there's just not enough discussion about that because people are very fascinated, just genuinely fascinated with optics, and they get really lost in this technical information, and they kind of lose sight of just the basic simple things that cause the real problems when you look through these scopes optically. There's also been comments like these things are, refractor-like. That's not true. It is true, it's yes and no, but I'll tell you why. when you first look through it, it's a reflector, like any reflector, a Newtonian reflector. There's nothing magical going on in this telescope. It's just a folded system, of course, but it does perform beautifully when it's acclimated. And you have to be very careful on how to look for those things. For example, body heat can crawl up inside the back of this thing. You can do a star test and run a star out of focus, and you can see thermals being created from the coming off the substrate, which tend to move in a series of waves and sometimes in circles around the primary. They look like these real slow moving waves. If I put my hand near the front, or there's any body currents, you get all these weird convection currents going and all these eddies. It's very dynamic. The important thing is that the air is stable, the telescope is as stable as possible, and everything is as still as you can possibly get it. It's vital that everything is still when you view the planets. John Pond's always told me it just takes the slightest wave to ruin the most subtle contrast on the surface of a planet. It doesn't take a lot. It's just a very little bit of a wave just to disturb the surfaces that you see. They're very delicate. And so I'm always weary about when people are standing around the scope, and always try to stay aware of those kinds of things. Okay, another thing I just want to emphasize is the environment that you view in. You know, here I'm at sea level, I'm at low altitude. The differences, the deltas from day to night are not that dramatic. If you have these issues, it's best to store the telescope in the coolest environment you can, or the environment that's closest to the ambient temperature it's going to be exposed to when you start viewing. But if you have a declining temperature where it's constantly dropping and dropping, it's very difficult for the substrate to keep up with that. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, and I really want to emphasize this, is that this whole debate about closed tube versus open tubes it's a back and forth argument with people. If I were to take a conventional mass-produced SCT and set it side by side, and I've done this numerous times, the actual images, if I were to take the telescopes and put them in the same environment and then expose them to the same environment at the same time, the views in the SCT for the first couple of hours are actually going to look a little better. It isn't until these things start acclimating and that they're really settled that they start to perform, and that's where you start seeing, like, wow, now I know why I'm paying my money for it. Just be aware of it, that just because a tube is open doesn't mean that it's great, it's going to cool fast. You have to be aware of that. It's like taking a fish and putting it in a new aquarium. You don't just throw a fish in a new aquarium and expose it. It goes into shock. What you do is you put it in a bag, you blow some air, and you let it sit in its environment and get acclimated to the environment that it's going to be surrounded in. And SCTs, in a way, are kind of like fish with a bubble, you know, with a bag around them. These things are like throwing a fish into a pond and not having any bag around it. So kind of give you an idea of what that's about. So one of the things I also want to emphasize, and some of the people that own the smaller Mewlons, like the 180 and the 210, so one of the things that happens is that they complain because they don't have a rear sill that they can remove like you can on the Mewlon 250 and the 300. That's perfectly okay. What I even do sometimes, if I don't feel like putting on the cooling angel, I can just take my chair, set it in front of the telescope, point the tube down like this, okay? Tighten the clutch, point the tube down, and take a standard fan from just a conventional fan that you buy at a hardware store for 10, 15 bucks or whatever, and just set it on a stool and blow air into the front of the telescope and let it circulate inside, but point it at an angle. This will cool the baffle. It'll get air at an angle. It'll get air into the baffle, and it'll get air circulating in and behind the primary, in the front and in the rear, because the air is just mixing all inside there. And the key is that you want to get the boundary layer stirred up and just mixed up to kill those thermal gremlins, because those are what's going to really degrade your image quality. So just get the fan, leave it in there for a good hour, maybe 2 hours or so, and just get it in there circulating. All the science for the times that it takes or requires to cool substrates has already been done. That subject has already been discussed. It is nothing too scientific that we have to deal with here. It's just a matter of getting air circulating in and around the mirror. A lot of people looking at this video are also using SCTs. You know, obviously if it's an SCT in the corrector, you're not going to be able to do that. There have, however, been situations where I would angle the telescope just to allow heat from the baffle to get out. Heat from inside the tube is going to have trouble getting out because it's trapped behind the mirror. It has to go through the baffle in order to cool. But what you can do is help clear the baffle. That will help in some ways. The other option, if you have an SCT, is you can get a Limax cooler. A Limax cooler is a device that sells for about $100. It's got a fan on it. I don't have one here to demonstrate. And it's got a tube extension that you insert into the back of the scope, and that will pull in filtered ambient air, circulate it through the tube to help it get it acclimated as quickly as possible. There have been some complaints where people used them and they had issues where the temperatures dropped more. You know, these are the kinds of things you have to weigh out. If you're not in an area that is conducive to getting world-class planetary views or views of stars, you know, there's a point of diminishing return on what you can expect. So the environment is crucial to what results you'll have and what you can expect. For some mounts, depending on the quality, the balance can be an issue. It just depends. In this particular case, we're using the mount visually. So, you know, if you look the way I have the tube here balanced here, it just kind of floats in various directions to my, you know, wherever I want to put it. This is fine for visual use. I have a counterweight up here to adjust. I can slide forward and backwards if I have an eyepiece up here, depending on the weight that I can adjust with it. Now, one of the things too, fundamentally, that I like about German equatorial mounts, and people complain about this, if you're a beginner, right, and you're flipping around the sky trying to look at Messier objects all night, you know, you might have to flip the mount here or over there in different sides of the meridian. I don't do that with German equatorial mounts. So the way I view with a German equatorial mount is I set up a workstation with a table. I put my books and my maps. I still use old school maps. I'm kind of old school. I kind of do what they call constellation mapping. You know, I'm just going to look at maybe 2 or 3 constellations in one night. I'm not going to be flipping all over the place. And that's a good thing when you have a German equatorial mount, because you get in all these precarious positions where you got to reorient the diagonal and refocus and all that stuff. So I really became attached to the Tema mounts, and of all the mounts, the Temas are my favorite by far. They are, as far as I know, the only mount that does not require any type of handheld handset. There's varying opinions on this. Handsets have features and things that are beneficial to some mounts. This one just comes with a dual axis controller. This particular unit here is called a Philos controller. They're just under $1,000. There's a gentleman in Germany that does these, and they're quite expensive just to have a hand controller. But the way this thing works is that instead of having a separate hand controller and a separate focus controller, which is what the Mewlons have, it's all consolidated into one handset that actually has a light as well, a little red LED light and a joystick, and I can reverse the direction, any desired amount, and I can adjust the speed of the focuser. Take in mind on here, on the focus on the Mewlons, the secondary is only moving forward and backwards, just the secondary. One of the things I like about this mount is that it's one of the only mounts that you can actually use directly with Sky Safari. Now, I like Sky Safari for numerous reasons. I think it's just the greatest thing that was ever put out because it's so intuitive and fun to use. It's very visual. The map's right in front of you, and the catalogs are endless, and not endless in a way that it's confusing. It's great in the sense that you can punch in Trumpler or Colander or Messier or IC, or and it's just such a wonderful program to use. The double star catalog is limitless. One of the problems that you have in, like for example, Night Sky Observer's Guide, there's either SAO numbers or there's WDS numbers, but in some cases there's no cross-reference. So if you have some computers, they may only have a specific catalog like SAO. But when you look in books sometimes, there's not always a listing for SAO numbers. So you could take one double star in Sky Safari and there could be 5 or 6 or 7 different designations for that one star. So it's pretty limitless, and I really like that, the ability to use that. And basically, what I'm doing is I'm bypassing the use of any hand controller on here, which makes it more reliable. All I'm using on the mount is just a dual axis hand controller. That's it. It's got no brains in it, The go-to in the computer is all in the iPad that I can attach to this. So it's really a beautiful thing. The way the polar alignment works is something that, like most conventional German equatorial mounts where you have a polar scope. The polar scopes on these are deadly accurate. I mean, really accurate. I've never seen a polar scope in any telescope that is accurate as these. And what you would do is just remove the front cap here, and then what you do is orient the declination axis so that the hole is exposed. Now on the TEMA, the EM11, you don't have that. There is no need to rotate the declination axis in order to expose the polar scope to the North Star. Something else really interesting, I have to explain to you. You know, there's a lot of preparation and work that goes into before you view, you know, the planets and whatnot. I like to view in the city and look at the planets. It isn't until you've done all these procedures and carefully that the details are staggering. So much color and so much detail it just becomes evident, particularly in a binocular viewer where you're sitting for long periods of time and staring at Jupiter. You can see the red spot and you can see multitudes of bands that you can't even really it's difficult to count them sometimes. And the images are really tack sharp. And I mean sharp. I'm not talking about soft and anything like that. I've never seen, no matter how many SCTs I've tested, I've never seen any kind of SCT or mass-produced telescope replicate what this thing can do on a good night. It is just mind-boggling. So for that reason, I love this scope and use it for the planets later in the evening when things are settled down more and I can take advantage of the additional aperture. Obviously, aperture allows you to see more and get more resolving power. But if you have thermals blocking you, it's not always going to work in your favor, so you have to take that into consideration. So next, let's go into some discussion about preparing the mount and how to set it up. So I'm just going to discuss with you how I have the mount set up to Sky Safari. I have a conventional 12-volt, 7-amp battery power. The mount in slewing mode only draws a few amps. That's it. So this is a 7-amp. This is a standard battery. You can get these at Batteries Plus. They're about $45 for one of these things. I like things as simple as possible. I don't like gadgets and buttons and knobs and everything. I like everything clean, simple, and reliable. This is a very reliable system. I never have problems with it. One of the things when you go to star parties is there's so many people fussing with their computers, trying to make things work. That's not what I drive out to a dark sky for. I want a view, you know? So basically I have the power connected there. I then have a SkyWire, hardwire, connected to a iPad, and I'm using the Sky Safari app. I'm using the old version 4. It's fine. It does more than I need. The mount doesn't have to be level. That's one of the cool things about it. In other words, the tripod doesn't have to be. What gets leveled is the bubble level up here. So I manually move the orientation of the right ascension so that the bubble level is centered between the two red lines. Now, and this is older TEMA 2, the standby light can be turned on. That means I can see the reticle turned on, but the scope won't actually be tracking, so I can sit down comfortably and get Polaris in there. On the newer model, it doesn't do that. We can discuss that later, but right now we'll talk about this one. So after I've done all that, I've leveled it, I've done my time meridian offset. I want to explain to you how this thing aligns. So once I've connected up to Sky Safari, that noise just indicates that the mount is now talking to the iPad, and typically around 8 p.m., if I look to the northeast, Capella and Auriga will be visible. So what I do is I orient the telescope towards Capella, and then I center the star in the finder scope using the joystick. After I've done that, I'll go ahead and center the star in the eyepiece using the joystick so it looks like it's in the center. Then after that, I'll go into the app and just type in Capella. Now, if you don't know where Capella is, then you can hold the iPad up and find it. But we're expecting people will know these things and you spend money on these kinds of things. So I go to Capella, and then I just tap Align, and we're good to go. And that's it. The telescope's now aligned. I will use a 1-star alignment. There's no other thing I have to do. I don't have to put in date, time, or nothing, because all that information is already stored in the iPad, so you're never having to fiddle around with that. Conventional mounts, you're having to work with handsets where you're putting dates and time. And another thing is that some of the handsets are not very well made. They're low cost mounts, and sometimes they have bugs, they have error messages, things of that sort. Sometimes you have to buy new controllers after a period of time. This kind of eliminates all that. So if I want to see M37, I just go into the search engine here, punch in M37, which is nearby, and then I just search it and hit go to. The motors on this system are very kind of whisper quiet. Some people describe it as a high-pitched dental drill. But they do sound really nice. They're smooth, they're beautiful, they're stepper motors. But when you look at stars at high magnification area discs, they don't pulsate. They're very beautiful. I'll just show you again. If I want to search for an object, I can go to M36, which is nearby. So I just punch in M36, hit search, and then hit go to. So now the scope is on the target. And you can just do this all night long with things. I've even had situations where I use high magnification, where I'm using Plossls or narrow field orthoscopics, and I'm looking at double stars, and it nails all the targets quite well. One of the things I would say that I would love to see SkySafari have is still to have some kind of modeling algorithm where it can correct for cone error or things of that, flexure or anything in the system that shifts or anything like that. But still, regardless, it's a wonderful working system. The other thing I would probably say is that it doesn't have slewing parameters, meaning that limits. Whereas, say you don't want the mount to slew a certain distance and hit the tripod or something like that. Maybe at some point they can do that, but so far they haven't done that. So this concludes the basic overview on how the mount works. If you have any questions, you can visit our website at telescopes.net. I also have a review site called drdreviews.com if you want to check out some of our more detailed reviews there. And thanks for watching.